As many of you know, this symposium is funded by the Alliance to Advance Liberal Arts Colleges, which is a national organization of the leading liberal arts colleges that funds a number of symposium, conference, workshop grants every year. They are meant to bring together the faculty from liberal arts colleges in this country, and the terms of these grants are such that we're encouraged to address the issues of pedagogy in these workshops. We come together to talk about teaching methods and pedagogy. And some of us are more enthusiastic about pedagogy and talking about pedagogy than others are. I belong to the camp of people who are less interested in explicit discussions of pedagogy. And I mean, it's not like that way. It's not that I tricked the deans of this consortium into giving us a grant in order to get together and discuss pedagogy, but then not doing pedagogy at all. No, I didn't. I was very open about what we would like to do here, to have a public symposium for faculty and students and colleagues from other colleges and universities to discuss Putinism as a phenomenon that has relevance for our teaching practices. By teaching, I mean teaching various subjects. I mean teaching Russian language, teaching Russian literature, teaching sociology, teaching political science, teaching history, and so on and so forth. And the deans of the consortium thought it was a reasonable plan. But to conclude this ostensibly pedagogy involving enterprise, I thought it was fair to actually have a rather short panel discussing the questions of pedagogy of pedagogy explicitly. But I want to add something else to this. I came to read 16 years ago, and my first maybe like 8 to 10 years here, I regularly taught courses on contemporary Russian literature, society, and culture. And they were great fun, and they were very enlightening, and I was very enthusiastic about doing this. And then at some point, I kind of lost interest in doing this. And I feel sort of speechless when I have to address the socio-political, cultural reality of today's Russia. And in a way, kind of the lyrical impulse behind organizing the symposium was my own speechlessness, my own inability to find a way to integrate contemporary cultural material in my teaching repertoire. With that, first of all, I would like to say that I thought that our conversation, discussions, and talks today were extremely productive and useful and helpful in the way of possibly helping me and other faculty members who, like me, are having problems with integrating contemporary material in teaching. But as I mentioned, when you're a Russian professor, you can always go to Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Eisenstein, Soviet classics, and just disregard, ignore Putinist culture. But that's not necessarily very fair to our students who may be interested in what's going on in today's Russia. Also, the issues having to do with contemporary socio-political cultural climate in Russia keep popping up even in the language classes. like they're things that you have to address somehow. Anyways, let me introduce the members of this panel, our distinguished colleagues from Pomona College, Professor N. Dwyer, Amherst College, Professor Cathy Ciepiela, and Williams College, Professor Aliev. And in preparation for this panel, I asked them to kind of think about a few questions. First question, which I presented them with, is kind of for starters in our discussion, maybe to share and briefly discuss the relevant current syllabi, which include contemporary cultural materials. I asked them, how would you characterize your approach to the selection of texts and materials? Which texts have triggered most productive discussions? Which ones have led to dead ends in the classroom? My second question had to do with the ways to productively integrate non-artistic, especially social scientific texts in the course on contemporary Russian culture. And actually I think that today we had so much excellent input of social scientists, and yesterday of social scientists, which will clearly enrich our teaching of cultural texts. My next question had to do with the current kind of political climate in which we operate. And I said, as the relations between the West and Russia are confrontational again, how does one avoid or deconstruct propagandistic cliches and political cultural stereotypes? And my last question was, how do we approach the anti-liberal trend in contemporary Russian culture without scaring our students away from the Russian studies? And with that, I open the floor for the panelists. Who would like
Does
to
the
go
order
first?
matter?
Well, so I have my PowerPoint. Do you want us to kind of do a dialogue thing?
No, let's begin with like short little remarks by you, and then we will engage in dialogue.
Okay.
By whom?
Beck, do you want to begin?
Sure. So, I'd like to tell you a bit about my course that I teach at Williams College. It's called Contemporary Russian Culture and Politics, and it's a hybrid course. It's an experiment for me. It's the first time I teach this. It's a course that combines reading literature and watching films with analytical materials. So materials from the social sciences, political science, sociology, and we read these texts side by side to kind of mutually inform them. And so one thing that's very important is context. We are really here after the context to kind of look closely into the background, the social background, which sometimes is openly, explicitly referenced in the works we read, but sometimes it's not so explicit, and yet we kind of go beyond it and we try to situate it in that political, social context. And as we do this, it emerges that novels become forms of inquiry and forms of critique and criticism, social and political criticism. So while the course does not really engage that interesting body of theory that does talk about artistic works as indeed being works of social criticism, we focus on more immediate reading, more immediate discussion of the tendencies in Russia since 1991, that is, since the breakup of the USSR. And these are the texts, the artistic texts that we cover in this course. There are 4 novels, 1 short story, and a few films. So the selection is perhaps fairly familiar to many of you, but I'll quickly mention just in case. Victor Pelevin, Homo sapiens, also known as Generation Z. This is probably, in my opinion, a cultural encyclopedia of the wild 90s. In there you have references to so many political figures, Yeltsin, Berezovsky, and you name it, all the social calamities and processes and the crisis that this decade is marked with. Andrei Kurkov is a Ukrainian Russian who is a Russophone. His novel Death and the Penguin is set in Kiev, and yet you could easily transpose this onto the Russian reality. And in fact, for the purposes of this course, it's not so much Russia that is the focus, but rather that looser post-Soviet space, which is focused in Russia, but some of the same trends can be observed in the neighboring countries. Vladimir Sorokin, so these two novels I've named are covering the 90s, and then with Sorokin we move on to Putin's era, since 2000. Day of the Oprichnik by many can be seen as a work of satire, and it can be read that way, but we also look at it as an example of the workings of the power ministries and the vertical power in its very grotesque way that it is presented in the novel. The How We Live in Sank is probably the thickest novel that we read. It is loosely modeled after the activities of National Bolshevik Party in Russia, which is currently banned, and it is very transparently referencing many real-life characters in Russian politics. So this particular novel is interesting because it touches upon the themes of civil society, because it's about an activist who is actively taking part in various street protests, there is police brutality, and of course it also raises the question of political party formation in Russia. Why is it that parties don't work? What is non-systemic opposition? Well, where are they driven? I also touch upon the theme of federalism with the situation in Chechnya, and I go back to the first Chechen campaign with the short story by Makanin, Prisoner of the Caucasus. And then the films also tag along there. They kind of touch upon the same themes that I have just mentioned in connection with the novels. Bimmer for the 90s, Leviathan for the more recent Putin's period, and then The Prisoner of the Mountains, again for the Chechen theme. Let me also give you an idea about the theoretical works that we read. Stephen White's Understanding Russian Politics, in my understanding, is one of the standard texts used in survey courses of intro to Russian politics, and I personally find it very useful because it's very very rich. There's a wealth of information, lots of details, and yet it is given in a very almost entertaining fashion. They're very easily laid out. So while there is some explanation of the more technical political processes, such as the face-off between Yeltsin and the parliament in 1993, the constitutional amendments, the presidential powers, there is also a lot of attention paid to the down-to-earth daily life of Russians and how they felt about living in the 90s, or how they liked Putin. We actually heard some of that discussion of Putin earlier in the day. So all of that is in this book. So for that purpose, it has been very useful. I will note here that we don't necessarily read all of them, but we do read about 50 to 80% of each one of these books. On the whole, the books that I find to be most productive for the purposes of this kind of a course, which is not geared toward any single discipline, even though this course is cross-listed with political science department and our own Russian studies, in addition to global studies and comparative literature. The works that yield themselves well for this kind of diverse crowd and multiple objectives are the ones that are interdisciplinary and the ones that are not steeply immersed in any technical, narrowly defined, discipline-specific theoretical basis. And so we've had lots of fun in our class working with the book by Vadim Volkov, Violent Entrepreneurs. Tellingly, this book was voted in Russia as the most popular academic read for the general audience. I would say this is the academic equivalent of a crime novel. It tells the story of racketeering gangs and how they emerged in the post-Soviet period, from being racket little groups into fully fledged legal protection companies, and eventually going higher up above into the power ministries, into the militia and police and Ministry of Internal Affairs. So it's a very readable, very accessible, yet very informative research. Alena Ledenyova study on informal practices in daily life and in politics, in business, is another example of a very highly suitable book for these purposes. What I like about these books, and the reason I chose them, is that they kind of draw a very wide arch. They touch upon politics, but also daily life, daily practice. And of course, with Ledenyova and the informal practices that she discusses, there are very clear trajectories back into the Soviet past, and those practices continue, even though they evolved somewhat. Brian Taylor's study on power ministries is probably the more narrow and specific one, yet it was very useful also because one of the central themes, given the selection of the novels, which in itself was partly determined by what's available in English, so one of the central themes has been the role of the coercive capacity of the state and the privatization of that capacity. And Brian Taylor in his book very well describes the hardships and perils of working in power ministries, in the Ministry of Defense, Internal Affairs, and various other directorates such as the Federal Security Service, from problems in recruitment and retention, training, professionalism, all of which open up a very ripe ground for corruption and infiltration or exchanges, conflation with what would be called criminal structures. And as we delve into this course, this is the first semester I'm teaching it, many things emerge which I did not necessarily plan for, but my students keep telling me about these things and I sort of collect them. So one thing that has been popping up often is that students are surprised how that line between the law and crime is so blurry. And it gives that eerie feeling, just like in the novel Death and the Penguin, which is very surreal. Let me give you a snapshot of our reading schedule so that you see exactly how we juxtapose the artistic and theoretical texts. So, say when we are reading Pelevin's Homo Sapiens, and we get to the two chapters that have scenes of racketeers coming, in one scene it's a Chechen, in another it's a nationalist Russian, and they kind of fight it off amongst themselves. And lots of rhetoric is used in between, such as krysha, roofing, strelka, naezd. And by the way, these terms are not always easily translatable into English because, as Volkov described in his study, this has a large connotation on its own within those struggles between organized criminal, semi-criminal, and police groups. And so, incidentally, looking into the context also brings us back to the texture of the text, to talk about translation, to talk about what's lost, to talk about the specific words and their meaning. So it enriches the meaning in that way. As one of my students have said, after reading Volkov and then seeing film Dimmer, which illustrates those racketeering processes, she said I could watch this film on a different level. And so to me that was pleasant to my ears, because that's actually an objective of such a course, to kind of raise the notch of reading, close reading, but not in terms of just paying attention to the structure, but also looking into the details and the context and bringing it to the foreground. So to continue my example with Pelevin's novel, there is yet another section on the workings of the media. In particular, the main character, Tatarsky, becomes a copywriter, and he is assigned to the so-called dirt squad. His job is to find compromising materials and to run black PR campaigns. And these terms, in fact, are used throughout the novel: black PR, compromat. And so I've used the two chapters, the relevant chapters from the Ledenyova study, that are specifically devoted to these topics, where she contextualizes it in its own history and its own necessity and function within Russian politics. So, in addition to the books that I have mentioned, there is also a wide selection of articles, book chapters and journal articles, and here's another example. The novel Homo sapiens is mostly about the workings of the media, and so this is kind of a running theme. And towards the end, I have my students read these three articles. One is about political capitalism in the Russian media, which I personally found very useful. It talks about the necessity of controlling the media in an environment of political capitalism, where private property is in fact determined by your political conditions. So going back to the idea of roof in a different context. By the way, roof or krysha is having someone higher up who protects your business and your interests. So Stephen White, again, in different forms. This is his article studying the elections that brought Putin to power in 2000, and he specifically discusses the role of the media and how the media coverage has been heavily dominated by Putin's presence in violation of the legal rules that were in place, normative rules that were in place. Andrew Wilson's book is entirely dedicated to the topic of mediatization of politics in the post-Soviet space, and how political parties are not necessarily grassroots parties or parties made up of really existing entities, but rather broadcast parties. They're created on the eve of elections, and they primarily exist on the airwaves. So here is a social scientific illustration of what we see in the novel as a postmodern simulacrum. Of course, in the novel it's given in a grotesque way, but we kind of look at the more scholarly reality behind it. So when it comes to evaluation, of course, there's the class discussion. This is a fairly small group, about 10 students. They write 2 essays, one midterm, shorter one, and one is expected at the end. The essays are on the literary texts, but I also asked them to give oral presentations, and they're about to begin them next week. I had given them this selection. Again, this selection was determined by the novels that we read, because the power ministries feature prominently there. We do have the heads of the Defense Ministry, Interior Ministry, and FSB, the Security Service. Because of the novel Sankhya and the political parties, I've also assigned some of the longest running political figures from the world of the parliament and party politics. And then the final batch of 4 people there are a mixed bag of things depending on the interest of people. And of course, Kadyrov is also related to the Chechen thing that I had mentioned. And we can also open up the topic of opposition with Navalny and other topics as well. So this is very roughly, very briefly, the structure and the idea for the design of the course. As I was designing it, I couldn't find other courses or syllabi like this, and so I kind of asked you, using this opportunity, if you're aware of a course like this, please let me know, because I'd be happy to talk to someone about their methodologies, their way of achieving this kind of symbiosis. Thank you.
I have a quick question. Do you go chronologically? Do you go with Prison of the Mountains and then move to the 2000s and then to the 2010s?
It's chronological in some ways. Overall, yes, we go from the 90s to the Putin's period, but with the Chechen theme, I kind of save it toward the end. Yes, so we go back, but that is also meaningful in the sense that the events of the 90s set the frame for understanding, the way federalism works itself out currently nowadays. Yes, so yes and no, depending on the specific topic.
Beck, thank you very much. We will have time for collective discussion a little later. Cathy?
Okay, I should say at the outset, I do not teach a course on Putinism, but I found it necessary to include a substantial section on Putinism in my course, my survey course on 20th and 21st century literature and film, which I reconceived conceptually as a course on catastrophe, beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution as catastrophe, and then grouping the texts that I read in the course, again, mainly film and lit, but also diaries and documents, around particular catastrophic episodes. Purges, World War II, and then ultimately, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. I agree with Putin. It was a great catastrophe. So I just found, because of that, the way in which I had reconceptualized the survey, I found that I had to teach Putinism. And so I reached for that final section of the course, which frankly I haven't taught yet, I'm just entering upon it. I reached for a book that I really admire by an anthropologist. So this is by way of addressing this question of incorporating other kinds of materials than just the primary materials. And I teach on the syllabus even, I make a distinction between primary materials and secondary materials. So I teach that whole problem of the relationship between the two kinds of texts, critical discourse and primary documents. So this would be, I would say, my most important secondary material for the Putin section of the course. It's a book by Sergei Ushakin, that some of you probably know. It's called The Patriotism of Despair, Nation, War, and Loss in Russia. And the reason I really like this book is because it gives you a way of thinking about what, I mean, in an uninformed way, seems to me the main issue of the Putin era, which is the apparent mass support for Putin, which one can characterize as a resurgence of a kind of great Russian nationalism. So the problem of nationalism and the particular character of nationalism in this period. And Ushakin really helps me think about it, and I'm actually having students read portions of this book. Has anyone read this? Mm-hmm. Okay. In this book, Ushakin documents how Soviet citizens mourned the loss of the Soviet world by creating their own symbolizations of connectedness, looking for a different way to think about how they're connected as a people now that the Soviet Union no longer exists. And he finds that the vocabulary they used was mainly a vocabulary of kinship and ethnicity. And mainly through, he argues, rituals of mourning. He talks about the ways in which mothers, for example, mourn sons killed in the Afghan and Chechen wars. And this is a quotation from the book. What is crucial in the cases described here is that the feeling of loss, the emotional memory of experienced or imagined injury, was not a result of withdrawal into one's private life, but was translated into ideas of national belonging. Stories about the nation and the country were used as a major organizing plot for individual accounts. So in the course, I sort of contrasted this to, in American culture, when people talk about trauma, it's in the mode of the individual going on Oprah, but, kind of crude compare and contrast, but by way of emphasizing what Ushakin has documented here, which is a way of coping with trauma that translates into or lends itself to a resurgence of nationalism and support for, support for Putin. It's also interesting for me to use this at this point in the course because I have actually used earlier texts that deal with trauma. I mean, hoary old classics like, I can't believe I used that phrase, Rakhmatova, but for Requiem, reading Requiem. Obviously, I'm not going to teach a survey without teaching Requiem. But the interesting, problem of Requiem then obviously the individual account merged, successfully or not, with an account of a collective experience. So it's a gesture made in Russian culture from all kinds of parties, right? Dissidents to others. So it's a very strong impulse. And what I like about Ushakin's analysis is that he describes how it's working in this particular period of post-Soviet period. Another reason I like it is because I'm putting it next to this extraordinary book that I've only just read, and I'm really glad to be teaching, which is Svetlana Alexievich's Voices from Chernobyl. Boy, talk about trigger warnings. This is an incredibly powerful book. How many people have read it already? Yeah. Okay, so you know who she is, right? And you know what this project is. She just won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which was controversial because what she does actually is collate and reshape at levels that's not entirely clear, in ways that are not entirely clear, testimonials from survivors. And she's got a couple of these books. One focuses on soldiers coming back from Afghanistan. This particular book obviously is about the Chernobyl disaster. And it's such interesting material to read next to an anthropologist's reading of this kind of material because you just get to hear the voices. Again, manipulated slightly, apparently, by Alexievich. But what you get to do is watch people symbolize their experience or watch them attempt to symbolize their experience. The way that Alexievich describes her project, and these are pages that are included in this edition, and this makes me think of your remarks, Masha, and also Siddige's. I've often thought that the simple fact, the mechanical fact, is no closer to the truth than a vague feeling, rumor, vision. Why repeat the facts? They cover up our feelings. The development of these feelings, the spilling of these feelings past the facts is what fascinates me. I try to find them, collect them, protect them. These people had already seen what for everyone else is still unknown. I felt like I was recording the future. So here's someone who is finding material and addressing two problems at the same time. One is the dubious facticity of anything in the post-Soviet era, and the other is this matter of how do you face the future? What is it that she imagines in these voices that might allow, and it's a little bit complicated here, of course, by the fact that this episode occurs in Belarus and Ukraine. I mean, those are the populaces that it affects. But she doesn't emphasize that in this account. She really brings together a lot of different voices, and many of them are Russian, because many of the liquidators, the people who were sent in to handle the problem, were Russian. So there's no, at least to my ear, there's no sense of national difference here. It's not central here. And also class difference. I mean, they're very different. There's the technical elite, technical intelligentsia, but there are also this simplest local people. One of the themes that emerges, and which also makes it so useful for a course that's trying to take in the long picture of the 20th century and the 21st century, is that the survivors themselves, the participants themselves, compare it to these classic Soviet traumas. They say, oh, it was just like 37. Most often they say it was just like World War II. It was a war. Someone even says, a few people say, it was just like the blockade. So they are reaching, that's the way they think about it. And yet, there seems still to be a crisis. They reach for those discourses, those Soviet-era discourses of heroism, And find that they're no longer usable, which is so interesting. Here's one voice. And by reading this, I mean to suggest that perhaps there are other operations, other kinds of symbolization that go on besides the patriotism of despair. That is, I think it's interesting to show the students that there are different ways in which one can symbolize trauma that could play out politically differently, ideally, possibly, in the future. So just a few quotations before I finish. There's a good joke. The nuclear half-life of a Kiev cake is 36 hours. And for me, it took me 3 years. So he's saying, this is my half-life. 3 years later, I turned in my party card, my little red book. I became free in the zone. Chernobyl blew my mind. It set me free. Another voice, and this to me is incredibly moving. Late in the book, if you'll indulge me, just for a few more minutes. I was an engineer at the Himvolokno, sorry about the stress, I don't know where it belongs, factory. There was a group of East German specialists there at the time putting in new equipment. I saw how other people from another culture behaved when they learned about the accident. And by the way, we all know, of course, that they didn't tell anybody about the danger. The book opens with the wife of one of the liquidators who was sent in his standard fireman's equipment and died within 2 weeks. It is the most devastating part of the book because she stays with him as his body morphs into a monstrosity. Zero protection on the roof of a nuclear reactor. So this is the broad experience that people are documenting, is absolute betrayal on the part of the state, right? How do you symbolize that? So back to this person. When the Germans learned about the accident, they immediately demanded medical attention, dosimeters, and a controlled food supply. They listened to German radio and knew what to do. Of course, they were denied all their requests. So they immediately packed their bags and got ready to leave. Buy us tickets, send us home. If you can't keep us safe, we're leaving. So what do the Russians do? They make fun of the Germans. They're hysterical. They're cowards. They're measuring radiation in the borscht. What a joke. Now our men, they're real men, real Russian men, desperate men, giant men, right? They're fighting the reactor. They're not worried about their lives. They got up on that melting roof with their bare hands in their canvas gloves. And our kids go with their flags to the demonstrations. But then this guy says, that's a form of barbarism, the absence of fear for oneself. We always say we and never I. We'll show them Soviet heroism. We'll show them what the Soviet character is made of. We'll show the whole world. But this is me. This is I. I don't want to die. I am afraid. And so he goes on to say, we're beginning to learn to say I. I don't want to die. I'm afraid. And that seems like such a powerful thing to come out of this experience of betrayal and abandonment by the state. And this, of course, could translate into something like what Olga was describing, a kind of self-help ethos or, a libertarian ethos. But it also could be a lesson from the Germans. It's like, wait a minute, you need to take care of us. It could be a different view of the state. And this is, I hope, Zhenya, also goes to your question about how do you teach illiberal? How do you teach Americans about this populace that seems to be so illiberal? Finding, for me, texts that open up possibilities. Like, well, these are, people who are struggling with a traumatic experience and trying to find the solutions to it. That it's still an open question, right? That the ways in which you could work out a traumatic experience could be various, and you can find analogies. Like, for example, it occurred to me to talk about the Flint water business. abandonment by the state that is supposed to be protecting you, right? So finding analogies, keeping a sense of an open culture is a way in which I try to make this material less alien and scary, and I'm just very struck by as you have been, Jania, by the focus on the 90s as a place, an era that felt like it was more in flux, where these kinds of things could play out differently if you go back to that moment where you have to figure something out, right? So that it doesn't look like it's all being figured out in the fashion that Oshakian documents in his book.
Cathy, thank you.
My turn? So I'll also begin with saying I don't actually teach post-Soviet stuff or Putinism. I mean, I do teach post-Soviet things, but I don't teach Putinism. But what I do teach, and I think both of your classes are courses in English, correct?
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about an advanced Russian class, but advanced here, as I think probably a lot of the faculty in the room know, can mean just got through 2 years of Russian and can barely understand anything, or coming back from Russia and have a great mastery of Prichasti, Dia Prichasti, and understand absolutely everything that's said on the news. And I think in terms of cultural and context, it's very similar. I might have a heritage speaker who knows absolutely nothing about Russia but speaks the language. And again, I might have the people who just came back from Bad Smolny and just took a class on Russian history and one on Russian politics. So we have this amazingly varied language competency, and I think we cannot underestimate how little Americans know about Russia. And so I'm working with these two givens, and I teach a course on everyday life in the Soviet Union. And I'm teaching it now for the second time. The first time I taught it was about 4 years ago, and I really didn't reach into the Putin era as much. This time, I'm doing it quite a bit. And so one of my main linguistic goals is for them to be able to understand spoken and written text in a wide range of genres, and we talk about genre and about rhetorical strategies and things like that. And we loosely go through the Soviet 20th century, and I pick a topic, sort of an object for each period. And then we also read, this is a new thing, we're reading Anya von Bremsen's memoir about Soviet cooking because it raises questions of everyday life, and she manages to invent or have family members who seem to be involved in absolutely everything that happened. So we also talk about the emigre's position, what she's writing from, and what kind of nostalgic vision we're getting here. And we read some basic sort of Russian essays, just context, like what was NEP kind of texts, right? And so I'm going to talk about 3 topics I have. And the move that happens in which I present some kind of original primary document and a little bit of context, and then I send the students out to find ways in which this reaches into sort of public discourse today. So the first topic is Komunalna kvartira. And this is how I started the whole class, because there's that great website put together by Colgate, Utyochen, and Paperna, Slava Paperna put together a great website that's in English and in Russian, interviews with жильцы коммунальной квартиры в 6 году. And lots of cultural materials. So we work with that a little bit. We work on audio, on comprehension. And then I stage, and their first reaction is, oh my God, this place is a dump. How can people live here? And there's this sort of self-exoticizing that happens in the videos. And then I stage a debate. And it's actually, this is one of the most successful moments in the class. I don't know, I'm not one of those people who stages debates, but in language classes it seems to work. And it's расселиться или не расселиться. I come in as, I know, probably if I were actually an agent по недвижимости, I would not meet with them as a group. It would be individual conversations behind closed doors. But we change that. We meet as a group, and they have to take a stand on whether they're actually going to be bought out of the communal apartment or not, and why. And suddenly almost everyone wants to stay. And so for me, this is actually a really interesting moment of, oh my God, this is a dump. Why would anyone live here? What happened? These poor Soviets, their lives were awful. Because that's, of course, what we've grown up with. Putin is awful. Putin is a liberal. The Soviet Union was awful. The Soviet Union is a liberal. Everyday life sucked. And so my job, I think, in some ways I'm pushing against the trauma narratives and this and that, my job is, I think, the everyday. At moments, it was extremely difficult. There's no way to say 1937 was a good year for everyday life. Or the blokada, which is another topic. And yet people lived and did things and made sense of their lives in particular kinds of ways. And so when we have this, and then the next thing I did just this year, there's always going to be something that just came up in the news this year. Sarah, whose last name I forget, at Tulane puts together a website with some news that's worked up again for Russian language learners. And she had put up some Dość videos about valutne ipotechniki, people who were protesting because they had taken out mortgages in euros or dollars and are now being defaulted on, basically, right? And they're having to pay these back, and they can't pay them back. And so for the more advanced students in the class, they present to us these interviews and talk about the problems, and it becomes then I present a little mini lecture in Russian with vocabulary presented for them, which Kostya helped me with, about exactly what we know about privatization and how that happened in the transition, and sort of where people may be landing now, and what the transition from a socialist economy to a capitalist economy means in terms of everyday life and housing. And so this is maybe 2 weeks of work, but we've gone from, on the one hand, this has been an introduction to the 1920s, we read some Trotsky, we learned about Buit, we did just tiny bits of theory of everyday life. I mean paragraphs, because we can't read a lot in this class. But then we jump into this, we managed to make it all the way to Putin. And we do this again and again and again. So very quickly, then another topic is the building of the metro in Moscow, right? So you get the Stalinist production, строительство narrative. We read then their main Russian text that I provide for them is actually Pelevin, Подземное небо. It's a little tiny essay he writes about how it's really a храм, and then he gets to the myths about крысы, которые живут там, like that, oversized, and people who disappear in the metro. So suddenly you have, in about 3 pages, an entire mythology of the Moscow metro presented, and then their assignment on top of the discussion of this, where we also talk about причастие, mind you, right? We get into, I basically say, okay, go search the Russian internet, find some sort of representation of what the metro means to people today, and bring it in and present it orally in Russian. Someone found the Читающая Москва вагоны, and was like, oh wow, I wish culture were valued so highly in America that we actually had Kornei Chukovsky, which we had of course read in Russian 2 or 3 or something, where we had Kornei Chukovsky on the wall. And then we talk about, well, what kind of culture is actually being represented in this, We have, someone finds a pop concert in a metro, very official, but in a metro car, and oh my God, a pop star in the metro. And another person found an advertisement for some energy drink that had people dressed up as penguins riding the metro. And so suddenly we go from, you can't take photographs in the metro, to penguins advertising in the metro. And I think we're entering this realm of this postmodern Putinism, and these sites that had these certain kinds of heroic valences being occupied by kind of official culture. And then I brought in for them, because they hadn't found it, the Vaina Pir piece, the wake for Prigov, as a kind of unofficial appropriation of the metro car space, which contrasted with the officially permitted pop concert in the metro car. So these are the kinds of dynamics that we look at. Then we also do the blockade. And I didn't know about the Dość incident, so that I'm going to bring that into my students. But I think what also happens is that there are these moments of these events that one finds out by accident. It's very hard to have this codified, what is Putinism now, because it's changing every day. And it seems to be in a very eclectic, very fragmented space of informational space. Like I heard about the one thing, I heard about and I taught the fact that there were advertisements for the new Детский мир, Любишь ребенка, отведи на Лубянку. And we talked about why that was problematic. but also how this Stalinist sort of very sort of funny, happy, creepy Stalinist vision is, what in German you would say salonfähig, that you can actually bring it into polite discussion. And so I think what I'm trying to teach them to do is, and I also, again, one last bit, is that I also tried to have them find analogies. So when we talk about communal apartments, we also talk about the fact of a propiska, which, like, what's a propiska? What do you mean you can't live wherever you want to live, right? And then I go, okay, United States history. Have you heard of Jim Crow? Can everyone afford to live in San Francisco today? So we think a little bit about these, the borders and the limits of our own sort of liberal, you can do whatever you want, individualist American ideology. And I had other examples, but I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Anne. Let me open the floor for your questions and remarks and free-willing discussion.
How many people are in the course?
Neil, please.
Oh.
That's easy, it's 6.
Neil.
I have a question for you. So, in this language class, do you actually teach students to identify propaganda
No.
in text? Or do you feel it's too early for them? Because I think, before they reach advanced mid-level by, pedagogy standards, by OBI standards, it's probably early. But do you ever consider it?
Well, that is not how I've ever framed it. What I try to teach in terms of both visual and linguistic production, I try to teach them to identify certain kinds of cliches. So we talk about, I actually give them a little tiny bit of Silishiev язык революционной эпохи. When we're talking about коммунальная квартира, and we talk about various terms like уплотнение and this and that, and then those, those combined nouns and all of these things, so that they learn that this is something that happened to the language then. And that then when they see certain kinds of cliches, for example, they might be able to identify that. For World War II, we watched the Koncert na Krasной Площади in 2015, and we just stopped the video at various points, and this comes back to who was talking about the citatness, but you don't know whether that was you, right? The real citation or whether it's a fake citation. And so that's pretty much what we're working on there. Okay, what visual language is being cited right here in the show? What visual language is cited right here in the show? So that they can start identifying maybe even visual codes more than linguistic ones.
Right. Well, it seems to me, I teach in a flagship program, so we have advanced students who are aiming for superior and become superior.
Well, in my 6, I'd say I have one of those, and he's bored. But I also have some who are, low intermediate.
Yeah, but I have to say that even those who are advanced mid, let's say, and that's very high, that means visual case errors, complete control, tenses, we really have a hard time seeing propaganda that would be obvious to a lot of educated native speakers. So, for example, we watched this film about Brodsky produced by Channel One, which I felt was propaganda. And I asked them, do you see it? Do you see any of the, Channel One typical issues? And they say no, because the narrator has cool glasses, just like any Portland hipster. Because the narrator has the cool glasses, they stop looking for anything that may be suspicious and fishy. And I think we as language teachers need to frame language assignments in ways that make them look for that stuff.
That's a really good point.
We need to wear the cool glasses.
But actually, I would say it's a little bit different, is that I think we have talked about the fact that what's so interesting about Putin's self-representation in official Russia is that it wears the cool glasses, right? The pop zvezda goes into the metro. Something that was once official and distant has become popular and cool and private and personal life. Like this intense personalization, that the cool glasses, right? I mean, I think that is something we've talked about. I probably could do more at the language level. Yeah.
Questions and remarks? Alex.
I teach a class of communism class in English, in sociology. And I was wondering whether either of you had considered any of the other disasters or any other kinds of movies. Like, how did you make a choice to feature the particular items that ended up in your syllabus? And I'm thinking in terms of your class, I use Putin's Kiss, I think it's called, which is about Nashiv, and a lot of the students it really opens their eyes. In terms of the other kinds of secondary literature, I mean, there's such a host of different kinds of secondary literature. In terms of the disasters, are there any other disasters that you have considered to sort of include in your disasters course? Like, how many disasters you covered? It's so hard to choose which one to focus on, isn't it?
Well, no, I mean, I didn't find it that difficult. I mean, I guess the idea of the course is that the Bolshevik Revolution, and, I start with, again, a hoary old classic, Alexander Blok. Fantastic, metaphorization of that event. It's like sweeping everything off the earth, this idea of total disappearance, total loss. And then it's filled with, Soviet construction. So you study, that allows you to study early Soviet period. But then you see that clash between reality and construction yielding these problems. So the first one, you do the famine, you do collectivization. So you watch Davzhenko, but then you read Platonov. So it's just pairing. So, I mean, basically, Holodomor, purges, World War, collapse of the state. I mean, yeah, there are so many, but in my mind, they're all consequences of this initial disaster. They all flow out of the Soviet experiment in some way. I mean, that's not the exclusive explanation. It's obviously overdetermined, but the idea is that this is an unfolding.
It's such I think my colleague teaches it as the great utopia, right?
Right.
So you have,
That's how we have been teaching it. Yes, but I think you have to just teach the tension.
But it's right. It's the other side. Different way of marketing.
Shall I quickly respond to the question also? So Nashi, the documentary, is on my list as well, but it's on a recommended one. And the reason I was hesitant was because I do find, in some ways, this documentary to be made for the Western audience and to propagate certain stereotypes. So if I were to require it, I would want to do some balancing work. For example, Julie Hammond also wrote about Nashi, where she emphasizes, the beneficial parts of it, the service to the community, which comes free. While it may have some other ramifications, but we cannot exclude one from the other. But speaking of documentaries, one that I do require is My Perestroika. We watch it at the beginning of the course, when we set the scene for the late Soviet period and for the what's coming.
I'm ending my course with that one. Sovietsky byt.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yes, I also found, particularly when teaching the 90s and getting at some of these alternative formations, Judy Monmouth's wonderful film, Baktygul, this is great, it's very funny. But the alternate, thank you very much, by the way, and Jenna, this was by no means just kind of a superfluous thing. Very, very useful. She didn't say it was superfluous, but what I wanted to ask is, each of you kind of touched on this to one degree or another, but I was wondering, maybe Anne, this is more directly for you, but to what extent you all emphasize questions of gender? How important is it for you to include kind of women's experience in all of these episodes?
Well, I'll take it first. Yes. Important question. I mean, it comes up immediately with what we talk about the phrase "byt zajel." We look at the Dayosh, Daloi Kuchone, Rabstv Dayosh Nobloi Byt. We're talking about reorganization of the family. We watch Tretye Mieszanskaya, which is, Roman Shklovsky's film about a ménage à trois, an accidental ménage à trois caused by housing shortage, in which the woman who may be impregnated by one, maybe by the other, doesn't get her abortion but hops on the train and leaves them both. In fact, another one of my hypothetical writing assignments, which I haven't read yet, was on the midterm, was imagine retelling the story from her perspective after she's arrived somewhere. Where the hell did she go and what happened to her, right? So yeah, huge.
Yeah, I mean, it's even just sticking with the Alexievich example. She really, a lot of the voices are women's voices. Alexievich herself, I think, views the Soviet system as patriarchal, so that's sort of built into what she does. Earlier in the course, it's it's Akhmatova, and Ginsburg. We read a blockade diary, and she has interesting comments there about gender, about how all of a sudden, in the conditions of the blockade, men had to start talking about food and cooking, and had to start standing in lines. So in an interesting way, there was a feminization of the male populace during the blockade. So,
I figure like Alexander Kollontai. Is that someone?
well, I have her in the course as well. I didn't put up but yeah, in the 20s section, sure.
I did not plan to talk about gender in my course, but the subject does come up. For example, when we discussed Homo sapiens, at the end, when we were looking at the entire novel, and we're trying to make sense of national identity, a central theme of that novel, it just naturally occurred, based on what has been said before, that just as the national idea, the Russian idea, is absent, so is women. It's entirely male world, male dominated, and when women are featured, they're featured in body parts or as sexual objects, and so.
Ishtar, it's the goddess.
Which is a fictional creature. So it comes up, definitely. And this is an ongoing course. We're about, 2/3 through the course. So
Did you have any women on your list of authors of major texts or films on that syllabus?
Yes.
Sorry, that's right, but no, I mean, it's also a problem, right? Finding translations in particular as well, I would guess, but I don't remember any seeing.
No.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not a problem with like Petrushevskaya or Wolitskaya. She has a
Yeah.
lot of stuff translated.
Yeah. I was.
Tolstoy.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
I think in
We-
Prisoner,
We have time for 2 more questions here.
Prisoner of the Mountains has a homosexual
Yeah.
theme, especially the text, perhaps more than the film.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and maybe the byt is like the Zhensky byt is missing from your syllabus. I don't know, in terms of like post-Soviet culture.
Maybe. There's so many things that could possibly.
Oh, I know. Who doesn't know that?
Final question? Question?
Is there I'm struck by is that especially in Cathy's account, it begins with focus on trauma and ends with joy, in a sense, and humanity and pleasure. So I wonder how the two are balanced in that world of your classroom on one hand. And another question would be simpler. Is there a way of teaching post-Soviet culture as the culture of women's empowerment? Are there narratives that we might look at that change our perspective on how gender works?
Mm-hmm.
Школа
Boy, would
стерв.
that be nice. Well, I mean, I'm not well informed enough, but I don't know if everyone in the room knows what an amazing poet we have in the room, Maria Stepanova. And in Russian poetry, if I were really doing what I wanted to do, I would also be including Russian poetry in here. I think there are incredibly interesting political things going on in poetry, generally, but especially by women. I mean, Fainailova, Maria Stepanova, Polina Barskova. that's an area of culture that is really exciting for women's empowerment. And, you know, journalism. Who are the most amazing, well, let's not remember Politkovskaya, but anyway, whatever, I don't want to think about that. But, you know, major figures in culture, and sure, wouldn't that be a great way to counterbalance the stuff that you're studying? Yeah.
I absolutely don't want to cut our really interesting conversation short, but instead I would like us to move this conversation into the reception room where the drinks and appetizers, refreshments are going to be served. So please join us for the reception in the Grey Lounge. But meanwhile, thank you so much for your participation, for your presentations, for your endurance, for attendance. I believe it was an exceptionally productive day and a half, and also very enjoyable despite the difficulty of the topic.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.